去几年共建“一带一路”，完成了总体布局，绘就了一幅大写意。今后要聚焦重点，精雕细琢，共同绘制好精简细腻的工笔画。
So that gives you a bit of an idea of what the Belt and Road is, and the reason why I wanted to cover this subject today is that it's the 10th anniversary of the Belt and Road, and there's a forum about to take place in Beijing that's to invite many of the members and leaders to talk about it. And I think it's interesting that for many years the West has had more than enough opportunity to help the countries, especially in Africa. And I have a short video I'll play in a minute about some of the projects in Africa. And for years and years, the West went into, especially the African nations, and they pretty much raped them of their resources and gave them very little in return. And it feels to me as if the US and the West want to keep those countries poor. They don't want them rising up. Now, what I feel China have done with the Belt and Road is that they've, of course, China have their own interests. Of course, they want to get resources, and of course, they want to sell goods to those countries. But in return for that, they're building tangible infrastructure. And this is something that, China just don't take back at the end. It's there for them. It's improving their lives. Because I think China see that by growing the economies of these countries, that they will become more prosperous. They will have a better life. And that benefits China. And it also benefits the rest of the world. And I think it's very interesting that back 10 years ago when Xi Jinping announced the start of this project, I think it was in Azerbaijan, because these are one of the central countries that are pivotal to the Belt and Road, that they actually invited the US to want to take part. And subsequently, years later, John Kerry admitted that was the case, and yet it wasn't even considered by the US. So do you want to say some words, Harold, and then I'll play the video about the projects that are going on in Africa?
Yeah, I think it's exactly as you said. Europe started colonizing the world about 500 years ago, and it's always been about extracting the resources to Europe and later to the US. The US has basically taken over as the global empire. And of course, while Europe extracts these resources, some of the technologies also spread to other places. But overall, the other places don't get rich, they don't get strong, and their life expectancy increases much slower than it increases in the West. Nonetheless, as you said, Europe would have been in the situation to really build these things like a Belt and Road, these build prosperity around the world. And we have all the NGOs, we have all the good talk, we have all the values and the morals, especially the moral, that nice sounding words are available in the West. But in the end, somehow we never managed to get it going. We've been talking of aid to Africa for 60 years, ever since the colonies freed themselves, and nothing happened. The only time when Africa really started to slowly see some economic progress, that's in the last 10, 15 years, when China really started to go into Africa and say, we don't treat you like former colonies, we don't treat you like basically slaves, we treat you like equals and we do deals with you. Yes, we want to earn money, because otherwise why should we do a deal with you? But we do fair deals, and you decide how these deals should look like. And there's a lot to be said, of course, in the China-Africa relationship in terms of learning curve, also in terms of who has the agency to speak for African countries and the corruption that's there as well. But overall, the engagement of China with these regions has been very positive. Same for Central Asia, if we talk about Belt and Road kind of core lands, because it gives these countries an option. Before they were just in the USSR sphere of influence and then the Russian sphere of influence. And now they can choose between different actors, and China is a new actor on the scene, which does not try to establish military bases. It doesn't try to use these countries to attack its neighbors, like the US uses Georgia to attack Russia or uses Ukraine to attack Russia, etc., etc. So I think China is really giving these countries an alternative option where it's all about trade and economic growth and prosperity, which is really win-win.
Yeah, and I think another thing that many of these countries will complain about is that when they've had sort of loans off the West, there's a hell of a lot of conditions attached, and if they don't abide by those conditions, they risk getting their government overthrown. Now, China just never does that, you know, and if you actually look into the details, a lot of the loans that are given by China are on much better terms than loans that come from the World Bank or the IMF. And there's obviously...
Well, and they can be renegotiated. I think that's
many have
difference.
Many have been.
Exactly.
And I think there's this whole narrative about debt trap. And there's a professor, I think she is a lady by the name of Deborah Broughton, who actually...
Broughton, yeah.
Yeah, Broughton, that's right. She actually wrote a paper actually debunking all of that debt trap. Yes, there have some countries that have got into financial difficulty, but that's no different with China's money than the money from the IMF and the World Bank. And actually some of these countries owe far more money to the World Bank and the IMF than they do China. So this whole...
Time and again,
yeah, I mean, this debt trap diplomacy was something that was coined in the media, and a lot of the media ran with it without even actually investigating it properly. You know, you get all sorts of rumours and nonsense in the press. What I'd like to do now, I'd just like to run a short video of some of the projects. This was actually produced by CGTN, I believe. But it just shows you some of the projects that China have actually done in Africa, and it's a pretty eye-opener. So I'm going to roll that video.
Of Africa's 54 countries, all but 2 had signed a Belt Road Initiative Memorandum of Understanding with China by April 2022. Major countries like Algeria, Ethiopia, Kenya, South Africa, Mozambique, Nigeria, and Uganda are all on board. A clear indicator that the flagship project of Chinese foreign policy in the 21st century is penetrating the vast majority of the African continent. The BRI is all about improving interconnectivity in Africa. Here are some examples. Churchill Ring Expressway and Port. The $3.3 billion redevelopment of Churchill or El Hamdania Port, which is 88 kilometers west of Algiers, is a hugely ambitious project which aims to link the Mediterranean with the African interior. Addis Ababa Standard Gauge International Railway. The Addis Ababa Standard Gauge International Railway serves as the backbone of the new Ethiopian National Railway Network. Another link to Ethiopia's gateway to world trade is the port of Doraleh, which is an extension of the port of Djibouti, 5 kilometers west of Djibouti city. The multi-purpose port has terminals for handling oil, bulk cargo and containers. Maputo-Katembe Bridge. The Belt and Road Initiative has also produced Africa's longest suspension bridge. The Maputo-Katembe Bridge connects the Mozambican capital Maputo on the northern bank with the suburb of Katembe on the southern bank. Construction work began in 2014 and the bridge officially opened on November 10, 2018. The construction work was carried out by the China Road and Bridge Corporation. A large part of the project was financed by loans from Chinese Exim Bank. Mombasa-Nairobi SGR. Meanwhile, in Kenya, the Mombasa-Nairobi SGR links a major Indian Ocean port city of Mombasa with the country's capital and largest city. At a cost of $3.6 billion, the SGR is the country's most expensive infrastructure project. The prime contractor was the China Road and Bridge Corporation, which had 25,000 locals in various positions. The Lagos-Kano SGR. In 2006, the Nigerian government awarded a $8.3 billion contract to the China Civil Engineering Construction Company to construct a standard gauge railway from Lagos to Kano. Since it opened in 2016, the rail is reported to have had a huge economic impact on the country. Entebbe-Kampala Expressway. The Entebbe-Kampala Expressway is a 4-lane toll highway in the central region of Uganda, connecting the country's largest civilian airport to its capital, Kampala. As of April 2022, only Eswatini and Mauritius had not signed the Belt and Road Memorandum of Understanding, but Mauritius signed a free trade agreement with China in 2019. Geoeconomically, Africa, with a population of 1.4 billion and a land area of 30.27 million square kilometers, blessed with considerable resources, is still seen by many as uncharted territory with huge potential to reach the centrality of the global economy in the coming decades.
So as you can see, that was a clip of a lot of projects that China have undertaken in Africa. And it's not just Africa, they have these projects going on all along the Belt and Road. You know, there's roads, there's railways, there's ports. I was actually lucky enough to ride on the Lao train that goes from Vientiane to Kunming. Sadly, I wasn't able to come right the way through into China because it was during the time of COVID. But it's a great train. It was quite funny because a lot of the stations are actually almost identical to Chinese stations, and I think it's interesting if you look at the media now. The West want to try and come up with something to compete, but nearly all the headlines and nearly all the reason it's to challenge China. You never see that, oh, they're going to build back better to help African countries. It's we're gonna enter into Build Back Better to to counteract China or to challenge China's sort of in that area. I think that's kind of funny, really.
Whatever happened to Global Gateway and what were the other ones called? So there's basically a new program every year. Most programs, I think they never even have a single dollar flowing into them. It's just all promises. And, you can do that twice or 3 times, but after a while, the global South countries will notice this and they will just not trust you anymore, will not believe you. And then comes another Anthony Blinken and announces another big major program. And, the heads of states, I guess they'll just be there, be like, show me the money. If something happens, fine. I'm going to sign some memorandum of understanding, but I'm not going to bet on it because so many times there have been all these paperworks, the media, the flashlights, and once the cameras are turned off, these projects just disappear and nobody talks about them ever again. And that's the difference with Belt and Road. I remember in the beginning, 10 years ago, how media in the West were like, what is it? We don't know what it is. There's no concrete plans. It doesn't have a concrete description what they will do. Mm-hmm. Is it a forum? Is it an organization? The Chinese don't know how to plan. They didn't even, make clear what this Belt and Road is supposed to be. But on the other hand, 10 years later, everybody's still talking about Belt and Road, and everybody sees the ports that are built and the trains and the roads that are built. And as you said, now the West is trying to make programs to counter Belt and Road. And the irony is that the more such programs the West makes, if the West actually would implement such a program, it would only help Belt and Road, because the fun thing about economic construction is that it's not competitive. It's not that if Europe builds a road, then the Chinese road loses its value. On the contrary, if the US and Europe build up an economic area, it only helps the economic area that's next to it that was built up by China. That's the point of such a big project, to have all the investors invest in the same region, and then it really can have positive net effects of all the investments going together.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the takeaway here is that the West tend to look at Africa as a problem, where China look at Africa as an opportunity. And I often think if you know, you look at the US and combine, they spend about $1 trillion a year on defense and armaments. Even if they took a fraction of that, they could do absolutely fantastic things in Africa. I mean, you look at the massive increases in trade that China are now doing with those countries that are fully involved with the BRI. You know, if you go back 20 years, I think you'll find the US was like the largest trading partner of most countries. And now they're not. It's China. And China have got there without wielding a big stick, without attacking people, without overthrowing governments. And again, this goes back to, you know, the West really need to look to China and go, well, you know, they're rising without making war. They're rising as a peaceful nation, and yet the West are just warmongers. You know, it's just unbelievable.
Yeah, I mean, we can get into a whole range of topics from there. That's definitely, there's so many interesting aspects. I just want to put one last point to it, which is Belt and Road. The original plan is really to connect Europe and China, and everything in between is that economic belt that will just prosper from it. Mm-hmm. So now, of course, it's gotten even bigger. Now Africa, Southeast Asia, and even South America are parts of Belt and Road. So it's become more like a global vision of global trade. But nonetheless, the idea is to connect the different economic regions and make everything in between prosperous. Mm-hmm. Whereas the US has always had the opposite target for Eurasia. And before the US, it was the UK famously trying to prevent Germany from having a shared or like a unified economic area with Russia together. And now, of course, it extends beyond Russia to China. So the US is trying to have this vertical cut in Eurasia so that Europe and East Asia cannot connect, whereas China has the opposite goal of connecting these. And I know Russia has fully bought into this idea of Eurasia. So Russia promotes this Eurasian Union, and they officially cooperate with the Belt and Road. And honestly, Europe's interest is to join these projects and to join this vision of a united Eurasia economic union. It doesn't mean that there will be no more cultural differences or political differences, but at least that the business people across Eurasia and Africa can work with each other and really create prosperity for everyone.
Yeah, that's right. You know, I feel that, you know, as I say, I went to Laos and I spoke to some of the people there, and they were very happy that they've now got this modern train, you know, and I think more countries are going to want the same kind of thing. I just also sort of want to just quickly mention before I finish on this project, very recently, America have been talking about a new project that they're going to do with India to make an economic corridor. And I'm afraid I just have to sort of smile to myself about that. You know, let's face it, China are probably the best builders of infrastructure on the planet right at the moment. They build some phenomenal infrastructure. And I just think it's kind of funny when you have America teaming up with India, who, both countries don't really have the best track record on infrastructure in their own countries, never mind building it across half of the world. And I think it's probably just hot air. I think it will never happen.